Hi there, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Thanks for joining us. My name's Sarah from Myosh. Today's topic is From Reacting to Learning, the next step in organisational effectiveness. Before I introduce our presenter, just let you know that the webinar is being recorded. We'll share an email with a podcast and a video recording later today. As with all webinars, they do attract CP continuing professional development points via the Australian Institute of Health and Safety. And if you have any questions, please use the Q&A panel and we'll get to those at the end of the session. Now, today's webinar is being presented by Andy Shone, who is the CEO of Southpac Group. So over to you, Andy. Thanks for joining us.
No worries. Thanks very much, Sarah. And it's a pleasure once again to be speaking to your Myosh audience. So welcome along, everybody. So from reacting to learning, what are we talking about? Reacting and learning. Well, I'm not sure about you, but we tend to find that many organizations that we work with don't learn terribly well from the oh crap moments they have from time to time. I had an oh crap moment a year or two ago. Man, it feels like a long time ago now. It's just before COVID. I was due to fly to India to deliver some training for a client, a global client. We traveled all over the world doing work with them. And we were all set to go to India to deliver a course and some training with them. And a day out from departing, or a couple of days out from departing, I suddenly had this thought, do I need a visa? Do I need a visa to go to India? I'm so used to traveling around on a UK passport and you can go almost anywhere, visa on arrival apart from the United States. I suddenly had this horrifying thought. I have not even looked at what the requirements are for visas in India. And sure enough, looked it up. And as Murphy's Law would have it, you have to have a visa, which you have to apply for before you depart. And it takes up to a week to process. Now, this is 2 days out before having to be in India to deliver for this client. Now, needless to say, that was a pretty big oh crap moment to have to speak to the client and let them know, I'm really very sorry, but I'm not going to be able to get to India. And you've got people flying in from the Middle East and different parts of the continent to come to Mumbai to attend this training. I'm very, very sorry. Needless to say, the client wasn't very happy. But we all have oh crap moments. This chap in EWP here has potentially had an oh crap moment. But how well do we then learn from them? It's a kind of a rhetorical question, but how well does your organization learn from oh crap moments? I'm going to share one with you, which I think is fairly typical. This is from the aviation industry. One of our businesses is focused on entirely the aviation industry. And even aviation, which is held up as being an absolute exemplar in investigations and learning from when things go wrong, which in some respects aviation is. Sometimes you have to have the same accident a few times before we really truly learn the lesson. But aviation's held up as being really good at learning. Well, here's an example from the aviation industry. This is a aircraft up in the Northern Territory. It arrived into the airport it was arriving at. And in the course of the aircraft being unloaded, a member of the ground crew team was pulling along a set of stairs. You've seen them, all seen them at the airport, pulling along a set of stairs behind them. And for whatever reason, the set of stairs has struck the leading edge and the winglet on the end of the wing, causing quite some significant damage and great cost to the airline, as well as inconvenience, obviously, to the passengers who have been shortly boarding that aircraft to depart, to be told, sorry, the aircraft's going nowhere. So this is expensive and it's inconvenient. They did an investigation, as good aviation organizations do. What did the investigation find? Well, here's some of the learnings, and I say learnings because I'm not sure about you, but I'm not really convinced many of these things can really be considered learnings. So here's what they came up with. Non-compliance with regulatory requirements. Well, I don't think there's any regulatory requirement anywhere that says drag the stairs into the wing. So that's kind of obvious. A failure to follow document control processes with respect to staff access to the manual suite. I'm a bit at a loss how that's contributed. Staff not adequately trained, lack of adequate supervision of team staff. Well, considering the steps or the stairs have been dragged into an aircraft, I think all of these things are somewhat obvious without even bothering with an investigation. Maybe the person wasn't adequately trained, but we see that in almost every investigation ever done. Same with supervision. Training and supervision is kind of like, well, if that's what we're going to come up with for every investigation, maybe we should just skip the investigation and just go straight to training and supervision. So this is not unusual to see these types of, I guess, common causes and fixes in investigations. And this is not just in aviation. This is almost in every industry we go and work with. We see these same sort of repeat investigations. It almost doesn't matter what the event is that's happened. The investigation almost reads the same every time. Why is that? Well, I think there's a few reasons why, and we're going to explore a couple of those reasons now. So I think, firstly, one of the factors that contributes towards this inadequate learning, and it's just going through the kind of motions. One thing is the pressure to be seen to be doing something, which I think sometimes is really very real pressure. It can be internal and external, and it can sometimes drive some quite strange behavior. So we're all familiar with the Bunnings Gate, the sausage sizzle scandal, where someone slipped on some onion in a Bunnings store. Of course, this is terrible and unacceptable. Unfortunate for the customer, of course, but the memo is sent out to all of Bunnings staff and volunteers. In future, to reduce this risk, can you please ensure that you put the onions and the tomato sauce on the bottom with the sausage on top? This reduces the risk of people being slipping over on onions or ketchup. Everywhere I go and I talk about this story, everyone does the same thing. They roll their eyes, they laugh, they can't believe that an organization as successful as Bunnings would do this. Another example, this one from the UK. This is a graveyard in Plymouth, where the council, who were responsible for managing the graveyard, they identified the fact that some of the gravestones may be a little unstable, and potentially they could fall on someone and hurt them or injure them. What do you do about a problem like that? Well, the other thing we have in our arsenal, as well as training and supervision, signage. Let's put some signs on the gravestones, the ones that are clearly unsafe. This will sort this problem out. Why would organizations do this? Was it not fair to say, well, pressure to be seen to be doing something, even whether it's either from a safety perspective or a liability perspective, means we end up doing things which we can all agree aren't fixing anything or making anything better. So I think you can combine that pressure also then with this other, I guess, real problem measurement, using of KPIs and dashboards, especially when we start talking about, well, this is leading indicators, which are showing us that we're doing the right things. So we start to see all investigations must be closed out within 30 days or whatever it might be. Great idea in theory, which shows, well, this is how committed we are to safety. We want to make sure these things get done. And we're going to put accountability on it. And we're going to measure it and then have little smiley faces or sad faces on the dashboard, depending on how we're going. But often what we find is by putting this pressure there and this measurement combined with it, what it actually does, it ends up just creating more of these kind of shortcut type investigations that really don't deliver very much in the way of learning. As Bob Edwards says, the pressure to fix outweighs the desire to learn. And we all have this hardwired into us, this want to try and fix things, get things fixed up, done, off the desk, cleaned up, off the desk, off the dashboard, and we can move on. But the reality is when we do this, we're not really getting into the deep sort of underlying issues. We just deal with superficial issues. So initially, we should be just responding and containing, sometimes we're trying to jump straight to fixing. This is not allowing for effective learning. So that's one set of reasons why I believe we're not so good at learning as maybe we should be. It's kind of the pressure internally and externally, and combining that with measurement. I think the second reason, or group of reasons why we tend to be not as good at learning as we should be, is our kind of obsession with more traditional linear thinking. And linear thinking is really only useful in very mechanistic, stable, known systems, whereas organizations, almost by definition, are socio-technical systems. They involve people, they involve multiple layers of people, multiple layers of stakeholders, involve very complicated and involved processes. This makes for a complex environment. And the kind of reductionist and linear-based approaches are not adequate for learning in that type of environment. So when we use certain tools, I'm not going to name any, but you're probably all familiar with what some of those investigation tools may look like. Oftentimes they kind of lead us towards finding one of these, one of these, one of these, one of these, and we have a drop-down box, which then, there we go, we've identified what those known kind of common causal factors are, and away we go. Again, doesn't necessarily allow us to go wide and go context rich to really learn and understand when things go wrong. So for example, with the aircraft, which was damaged on the ramp by the mobile stairs, I understand these kind of generic things from the investigation, which I could have probably guessed before the event even happened. But I know nothing about the day, the conditions, the weather, about the actual configuration of the stairs, the layout of the ramp, any of this context around the actual work, what else was happening on the ramp, what else was happening with the team, all of these types of things, which may have been useful learnings, I know nothing about. I know nothing about the task that was trying to be achieved. So a more complex and a more context-rich tool, which is built for complexity, is really what we need. Just to go back to that point, when we go in with this kind of lens, what we end up finding is the same sort of things. What we look for is what we find. And you've probably seen these types of things before. Causes, operator didn't follow procedure. Well, if that's what the cause is, the fix is obvious, isn't it? Remind all operators to follow procedures. They didn't know about the procedures. Okay, well, issue a read and sign. Make sure people have read them and then acknowledge the fact by signing off and saying, yes, I have now read this. Inadequate procedures, inadequate supervision. Oh, well, that's, again, these problems are therefore obvious what the solutions are, right? Write another procedure, improve the supervision. Okay, operators are still not following the procedures. Well, then at that point, then it's obviously a bad operator. Blame them, or blame, shame, retrain, or just as some organisations do, just fire the operator altogether. They're just a bad apple. I'm sure you'd all agree this really isn't learning in so much as it's just going through a routine, a well-known, well-trodden routine, coming up with the kind of well-known, recognised, typical causes or problems and well-rehearsed fixes. This, unfortunately, ignores something we really all intuitively know deep down. And this is what we call in new view safety, the difference between work as imagined versus work as done. Now, many traditional approaches and investigations fall into the trap of looking at work as imagined, i.e. procedures, policies, and guidelines, and all these types of documentation, and then measure what happened on the day and clearly identify the gap. Oh, well, here's what was supposed to be happening, and here's what was happening on the day. Well, that doesn't take Einstein to figure out that there was obviously some kind of mismatch. And very often there is a mismatch, but identifying that mismatch is not the same as identifying causes or the actual problem per se. Oftentimes this gap between work as imagined and work as done, between the black line and the blue line, is merely a symptom of other more underlying issues. Oftentimes we label the blue line as the problem, as opposed to seeing this is a symptom of other problems that we need to understand. And that investigation we just shared is, like many others, one which has identified some symptoms, maybe not even the most important symptoms either, for that matter. So what we had to all get way more interested in, and this is applicable to both when things go wrong, but also equally when things are going well, is where is the blue line in our organization? Or more to the point, where are the blue lines? Because every organization has multiple blue lines, which is the natural variation and adaptability of work and our workers. What we need to be more interested in is, why is this variation and adaptability there? I can assure you it's there in your organizations, whichever industry you're in. Every industry we go in and do things like learning teams, we see this blue line, we see this variability. And it's not because workers are just optimizing for their own benefit. It's oftentimes in response to inadequate tooling, inadequate time, inadequate information, competing pressures, poor procedures, production pressure, whatever it might be. There is generally a whole range of combining factors which influence that blue line being there. So if we want to understand the blue line and why people do the things they do, we need to speak to the people who know the blue line. As is mentioned there, the workers are the masters of complex adaptive behavior, masters of the blue line. So rather than being just satisfied with identifying a gap between the black line and the blue line, we really want to understand the blue line. So what does this look like in practice when we go along and do an investigation or a learning team or whatever it might be? Well, what it reveals is there's a whole raft of different things that are going on when there's an event. But interestingly, those same factors typically exist in successful and normal outcomes too. There really isn't that much of a difference between an event and normal work. Most of the ingredients are there, it's just the same. The big difference is how they combined on the day in question when we had an event. So we're more interested in understanding the normal conditions of work as opposed to saying, we've found the cause. Because what we're really doing when we pick out a cause is we're making a choice. We're picking out one of these factors in amongst this messy story and going, this is the one, this is the cause. And believe that's actually an objective fact. We're more interested in the whole. We should be more interested in the whole and looking at the wider context and seeing how the various different conditions and factors came together on the day. So, where to from here? And I just kind of spent all this time telling you about the limitations of many different methodologies that are currently based on linear thinking. What's an alternative? Well, I've alluded to one already. Well, the first thing before we even do that, before we start talking about particular methods, one thing is to say is we need to slow down and learn. We need to be more disciplined in allowing learning to happen rather than rushing to conclusions and then rushing to action. We've worked with a client where if an event typically say happened over the weekend or on a weekend shift, by Monday morning, they'd be sitting down for the management meeting and they'll be saying, okay, what happened? What's been done about it? Root cause and close out of the fix. Like realistically, how effective is A, the learning, or B, the fix going to be if that's how quickly we've been able to close things out? And what this ends up looking like long term is a game of whack-a-mole. You know, at the fairground when they've got the moles kind of popping up and you're chasing after them the whole time with the hammer. If you feel like you're playing whack-a-mole sometimes in your organization, maybe we're not fixing the underlying issues. So the first thing is to slow down and learn. The second thing to think about is if we want better answers, i.e. we want better information to work with so we can get more effective fixes, we have to ask better questions. questions which really reveal more about the context of the work and the messy nature of the blue line. Again, this is rather than going in with types of questions which are very much focused on the outcome that maybe we believe we already know, and then we're going quite linear again towards that. It's allowing for questions to be asked which go wide and reveal more about the context. Now, the questions alone may not be enough. We also then need the right setting in which to ask these questions. And that's what leads us to learning teams. So I'm not going to go into great detail around learning teams today. We actually have a guide which covers off on these 10 steps, which we're happy to share with you. If you're interested in getting a copy of the guide, connect with me on LinkedIn, send me a message, and I'll share that across with you directly. But a learning team is essentially a structured way of having a conversation with those who know the blue line the best. A learning team can be used post-event. So when we've got an oh crap moment and we want to really get a deeper understanding about that, we can use a learning team. But even better, as they're sometimes referred to, we can use them as a pre-accident investigation. We can use them before anything's gone wrong to get an understanding of the normal work and identify many of the same conditions and constraints that exist when we have an event. So how does a learning team work? Well, at a high level, first of all, we have to determine a need to do a learning team. So that might be an event, or better still, it may be just, we want to understand this particular task better. We want to understand this particular critical risk better, and also understand how effective our critical controls are around that task. That might be a really useful place to do a learning team. But really, there's almost no limit to where a learning team can be used, so long as the intent is there to use it to learn. So we have to first of all determine a need, and then we have to involve a sponsor. Who's a sponsor? Well, it really could be anyone, so long as that person has the relevant authority and influence in the organization to allow this learning team to happen, and then for the findings and the recommendations to be supported, and for them to ensure there is no blowback on the people who are involved in the learning team. So someone with sufficient, authority and power in the organization to provide that. So it may be a general manager or an EGM, maybe a plant manager, whoever it is, someone who can provide that kind of level of support. So we need that sponsor involved, and then we also need to prepare. What does that look like? Well, our guide touched on some of the things which are typically good to do before you sit down with that group of people. This can be quite an intimidating and kind of scary thing to do a learning team for the first time. It's very different to some of our traditional tools. It's far less structured, and that in itself can be scary. As safety professionals, we like to have structure which we can fall back on, and that makes us feel, with all of us, we're human, it makes us feel more safe and secure. This is a bit different. So good preparation can help. And one of the most important things to get right in that preparation is to know what your first question is going to be. That's the hardest part. I think, to get right. But once you get that conversation happening, the facilitator is more or less then just allowing the conversation to happen. So the learning team itself, that second phase, what does this look like? Well, you typically have a group of blue line workers together. You have a facilitator and hopefully a scribe. So that's maybe yourself and someone else with you. You introduce the session, that people know that the purpose of this learning team is to firstly to learn about the work, not necessarily about the event. We're there to learn about the work that was happening when that event, leading up to that event. That's really what we want to understand. Tell me about normal work. And that whole first session, we make it very clear to the people, it's very safe. There's going to be no comebacks. This is a kind of Chatham House rules type situation. We want to understand their perspective and get the blue line stories and allow this just to flow and to happen. So we can then really be dealing with the real issues, the underlying issues, not the surface surface issues. And that whole first session stays with learning. People sometimes are very quick to want to, oh, I've got a great idea. I know what we could do. I know how we could fix this. And we say, yeah, that's great. Really appreciate that. Just sit on it for now, because we're not doing any fixing yet in this first session. And ideally, then, if you've got those 5 or 6 or 7, however many people are in that first session, the conversation just flows and it goes backwards and forwards, and you don't end up with necessarily full agreement between all the key parties, but that's fine. Divergence and different perspectives all add to the color of what we learn in the learning team. We then allow for what we call soak time, for people to go away. Ideally, this is overnight after that first session, and they can have some time to kind of to think and reflect on that first session. Lots of amazing things happen in that soak time, especially overnight. As you all know, sometimes you can wake up with a great idea, or something else comes to your mind which you didn't share in that first session. So when we sit down for the second session and review that first session, people invariably will say, actually, I've thought of something else I should have shared. And they've got something else to add. And that tends to work really well. And it's at that point then we say, okay, right, if we're assuming we've learned all that we can about whether it's the event or the work or whatever it might be we're doing a learning team on, we then say, okay, now let's go into potential solutions. Now, there's a lot of different things to say about that, but I'm not going to go into that too much at this point in time. But what that allows is for worker-led insights and then worker-led type solutions, which, as we all know, that involvement and that kind of really does get commitment. People are way more committed and involved in a process that they've actually been given the power in. So the wrap up and review is then a process which we, of course, debrief with the participants, but also then the original sponsor, because we're then going to need their involvement oftentimes and support to be able to then go away and make these things happen. That's the final step 10, and that's really, really important, is the follow-up and making sure we get some quick wins out of this process, if at all possible. Because this is where we really start to see the incredible impact of learning teams. Oftentimes, some of the ideas are really very low cost, and people just need permission to be able to put some of the ideas into effect. And what we see really very rapidly is, beyond just the tangible benefit of learning teams, is the intangible benefits. Have you ever heard of anybody putting their hand up in your organization saying, hey, can I please be investigated? I'd really like to be involved in an investigation. If you have had that, I want to hear about it, because I don't believe I've ever heard of that happening. With learning teams, once an organization is starting to get learning teams going, you'll start to have people saying, I've heard about these learning teams. I want to be involved with one. Now that is evidently taking away the fear and the worry that it goes along with some of our traditional tools like audits and investigations, when people want to be involved with a learning team. So there are different ways in which people are going about doing learning teams, and that's fine. But I would say the kind of critical aspect really you can't really deviate too far from, if you really wanted to be doing learning teams effectively, is to have this kind of cycle built into it. Learning, defining, and improving. First of all, it's got to be about learning. A learning team which almost immediately starts going into fixing isn't really a learning team, because we're not learning anything. So it's got to be going deep. I remember having a conversation with a client in the States, and one of the senior managers in the room said, we're already doing this. We're not calling them learning teams, we call them safety action teams, but it's basically the same thing. And one of their colleagues who've been involved with learning teams kind of fired back and said, okay, then tell me, in your safety action teams, do people talk about violations, the times they break the rules? And this manager said, oh, no, he wouldn't talk about that in a safety action team. He said, well, you're not doing learning teams then, because you're not really getting down to that level where people feel sufficiently safe to be able to talk about the real deal of how sometimes work happens and the things that are required sometimes to get work done. So there's got to be that learning aspect first, then some kind of process around how we define then what the issues are, and then finally the improvement. Okay, what are we going to do about this? How are we then going to improve and fix some of these underlying issues? So learn, define, improve is kind of really the underpinning phases of a learning team type process. So what do we get from a learning team? Well, as I mentioned, learning and insight. Which management team doesn't want better information, better data about what's really happening in the organization? Even from a traditional safety perspective, learning teams are one of the best ways of going about demonstrating true due diligence, understanding the true state of hazards and risks in the organization and what the real issues are as they're happening. So that learning insight is invaluable, which in turn then leads to better actions and improvements. Not the kind of usual safety work type solutions, training, supervision, reading signs, procedure rewriting, and so forth. But for me, what's even more important than those tangible outcomes are the intangible outcomes, the sharing of stories. We know this happens in organizations. We have the grapevine. People start sharing about this process they've been involved in and what happened. And this changes the narrative over time. Organizations in the past have spent a lot of time talking about changing culture and improving culture, but then spend the whole time talking about culture. Well, I don't think you change culture. I don't think we can change culture, if I'm honest. Certainly not in the short term. But I think you can change the narrative and change the stories and change the actions that the organization does on a day-to-day basis, which in turn over time changes culture. And this generates engagement and trust. It builds engagement and trust, and especially it kind of closes the gap that exists sometimes between frontline and from those further up in the organization. When we've sat in on learning teams where in the debrief, we've had a plant manager or a senior manager sitting with frontline workers, in one instance over fish and chips and mushy peas, this is in the UK, and having a really honest conversation, but you could see the engagement and trust being built as the conversation is happening. And not only that, they came up with some great solutions and some great improvements for that particular plan. So that's how we learn from oh crap moments, through the use of learning teams. But as I mentioned, this isn't just for when things go wrong, for oh crap moments. Now, question here, how well does your organization learn from everyday work? Well, we don't have that many tools we can use for learning from everyday work. Maybe sometimes our audits and inspections are focused in the right place. They're focused on not an event, but day-to-day work. But oftentimes they're focused on the black line. Are people following the procedures? Is this policy being implemented? And so forth. Do they allow us to understand the blue line of everyday work? Because if we can develop this ability to learn from everyday work and from the blue line, as Eric Holnagel would say, moving from just this focus on this small red box to the whole green box, we are dramatically increasing the amount of opportunities we have to learn. 99% of things that happen in our organization go well or go without incident. That gives us many, many more opportunities to learn. And as we said before, most of the same conditions and context exists in that successful green box as it does in that small red box. So, as I mentioned, learning teams are a relatively new method and approach for learning about and from events, accidents and incidents, but also from normal work. The final thing I'd say though, the tool is not nearly as important as the operating philosophy that underpins it. And this operating philosophy is really, in my opinion, more important than the actual tool of learning teams. And if you don't have these things in place, or some of the elements of these things in place, you're going to really struggle with learning teams. So the 5 principles of HOP help create an environment where learning teams can be successful. It's creating the right conditions for success. And what does HOP involve? Well, the first principle, people make mistakes. That is just part and parcel of being human. We're fallible. We will all screw up at times. We'll all have oh crap moments. Just focusing on the mistake is really not very useful. It doesn't enable true learning, stigmatizes the mistake, and drives learning away. Very much in keeping with that, blame doesn't make anything better. It might make us feel better, but blame fixes nothing. In actual fact, it generally makes us worse because no one's ever smarter for knowing less. And blame is a prime way of shutting down learning. So we see the importance of these first 2 principles, accepting the fact people make mistakes, and blame fixes nothing. Third, and this is really important, context drives behavior. That's what we want to be way more interested in, is the context. When things go wrong, when people make mistakes, even mistakes can include violations, routine violations. I know we can get really kind of worked up about violations sometimes as safety people, but rather than focusing on the behavior, we should be way more interested in, okay, why did this behavior make sense? Why did it make sense for this person to do this? Because if one person's done it, you can almost bet your bottom dollar someone else has done it before. One of the stories that I often share in a training environment is of an employee who got injured at work, putting their hand into a non-isolated piece of equipment. That was a golden rule in this organization: lock out, tag out. You break that rule, you're out of here. And they'd fired loads of people for breaking golden rules. And the question came up, they reviewed the CCTV footage of this particular worker. Yeah, we've identified what had happened, put their hand into a piece of equipment, not locked out, tagged out. Member of staff close by triggered a sensor, which set the machine into motion and trapped this person's hand. Now, fortunately, they weren't badly injured. Well, the first question I asked them when they told me about this was, why would anybody put their hand into a non-isolated piece of equipment? Why would you do it? Why would you risk your hand for someone else's machine? And this, especially when this is an hourly worker, doesn't make any sense to me. So what have we got to learn to understand that? What is the context? And invariably, when you go away and look with curiosity and humility and to try and learn about this context, then you start to find the conditions and the context that make this behavior make sense. But you can only do that by talking to the people who do the work every day, the blue line worker. And as it happened in this organization, in that particular setting, it was not unusual to put your hand into this piece of equipment because it broke down so often. And if they went through the full lockout, tag out procedure every time, the plant would never in a million years make its production target. But there was a whole lot of other stuff in there besides that. But that's the question we've got to ask. Why does this make sense? And that leads us to context, not to the individual involved. That ties in with the 4th principle. Learning is vital. We've got to want to be interested in learning about the context. But to be able to do the learning well, to be able to really get that insight and understanding of the blue line, we've got to change our response to failure, and we've got to respond in a way which is mature. So that's really our 5th principle. Response matters, not reaction. Reaction is knee-jerk sometimes. Response is deliberate and considered, and it's not based on emotion. I think Daniel Kahneman, thinking fast, thinking slow. Fast thinking can be very impulsive. It can be emotional. Response is slow and deliberate and allows for that learning to happen. So learning teams are great. Learning's really, really important, but set the scene first. Prepare the soil in your organization. Prepare the soil through the use of these principles, and you'll have great success with learning teams. So that's the material we have here for today. It's a quick fly through of moving from reacting to learning. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, a couple of questions coming through here.
Do you want me to read them? Or...
Yeah, sure.
Okay, first one. What are your thoughts on the ICAM investigation method?
So, so I talked before about a bias. What you look for is what you find. And I'd say ICAM, like most investigation tools, sets us up to go and look for a particular set of things. So that template, if you're not careful, which is essentially what the ICAM report is a template. If you're not careful, that drives the investigation. And we're looking for an action, an individual action. You're looking for the precondition. You're looking for an organizational factor. And what we often see is you end up with one in that box, one in that box, one in that box. So if you're not careful, it can drive very narrow and linear type investigations. That said, a good investigator, I guess, with time and with a bit of, I guess, exposure to some of these new ideas, could do a reasonable job with an ICAM. But I would just say, by and large, my experience is most ICAMs I review tend to produce very predictable results, which is kind of more or less the example I showed earlier on. So I wouldn't say definitely don't do ICAM, but I would say I'm cautious of any sort of approach which is too rigid.
Okay, so James says he's curious if you've seen the gap bridged in larger organisations where learning teams have been introduced and the executive still wants success measured in metrics or qualitative, quantitative data around a measured change.
Hi, James. Good to see you online. We try and very much push back against introduction of more measures. Qualitative is great. Qualitative data can be used without having a specific measure. And that's kind of, we talk about the sharing of stories. So sharing the story of the success with learning teams, both sharing what's been learned, but then also sharing the results. These are some of the things that we've been able to improve or change through the use of learning teams. But I would really caution against the use of quantitative data out of learning teams, because I think most things, when we try and turn them into quantitative data, they lose most of their richness and context. So yeah, I hope that answers the question, but I would be very much against, or as much as possible, cautioning against quantitative data and learning teams.
Anonymous has asked, what's a good number of people for a learning team review?
I guess the smart response would be, how long's a piece of string? Because it depends on the complexity of the issue that's just being looked at. But I think, in my experience, between 4 to 7 is probably about the optimal number, because beyond that it can start to get a bit unwieldy. But then I know people who do learning teams much bigger than that. So I would say there's no right or wrong answer, but my preference is in that kind of 4 to 7, unless it becomes very clear someone's missing. You're like, okay, we keep on coming back to this same thing, and there's no one here who's kind of essentially a blue line worker from that particular perspective. So let's try and bring someone else in who can add that perspective.
Okay. Also, are there any basic guidelines for running learning teams available?
Basic guidelines. Yeah, so as I mentioned, we put together a guide for learning teams, and there's also a whole heap of stuff around learning teams on our website, southpacinternational.com, or on the HopLab HopLab channel on YouTube. So just put on HopLab, HOPLAB, into YouTube, and you'll find a bunch of stuff about learning teams there too. So yeah, there's loads of free resources.
Also, I put your LinkedIn link in the chat earlier. So
yeah, awesome. Yeah, anyone message me on there and I'll send it through.
And so Daryl says, what about risk scores? How useful are they in reducing or controlling risks?
Probably a little bit out of my specialism for this particular session today. I think risk scores and risk assessment, maybe give Mark Alston a shout on that. I won't venture too far into the risk space today.
Okay, and Valerie has, actually, she said, yes, great question, James. What do you think our KPIs should be?
Everyone loves talking about measurements, don't they? I'm not going to provide an answer on that, I'm afraid. I've yet to be convinced by almost any measure I've seen, to be honest with you, whether it's leading supposedly or lagging. Most lagging we have to have. We do want to keep those things, and we have an obligation to report them oftentimes to the board or to the ASX, whatever it might be. A lot of leading indicators that I look at aren't really that useful or leading. They're just measuring activity. And they don't tell us anything about the quality of that activity. So for argument's sake, you might see a number of inspections done, number of audits done, number of inductions done. Well, so what? You're just measuring the activity itself. It may be useful, but how useful are those tools in the first place, or how well are they being done? So I think if you're interested in that, look at some of the resilience engineering and safety 2 kind of perspectives, which are more interested in, again, measuring things which relate to the work as opposed to safety specifically. So that's I guess all I could say about that.
Stephen says, hi, Andy, what advice would you give to people starting out doing this work?
It's a good question. Good to see you online, Steve. What advice would I give to people starting out? So it goes, if you're getting interested in operational learning, what I'd say is there's 2 things that are really important to be good at operational learning. It's curiosity and humility. If we go in thinking we already know the answer, that's not a good starting mindset. We've got to go in wanting to learn, and to do that, I think the best way to do it is to assume we don't know the answers, which is a fairly safe assumption to make, because most often than not we don't anyway. So it's just good to acknowledge the fact that we don't know and be really curious. When people are cranky with us in the learning team, be curious about that. Why are they so cranky? Oftentimes it's because people care, and they've not been given the chance to be able to share their perspectives or their thoughts. If people are saying strange things are happening, okay, well, why is that? So I think curiosity is really important, and it's kind of talked about a lot in the new view, but I think humility is important too.
Michael says, how have you found business change their methodology and culture to learning teams?
How? Well, it's a good question. Oftentimes when we're working with organizations in the learning team space, they've already been doing stuff in the new view to begin with, or they engage us and we start with that first. So what I'd say is you have got to start with the kind of the organizational beliefs and I guess logics and so forth before starting the learning teams. That's my perspective. I wrote an article about this just last month, which is on my LinkedIn. Can you do learning teams without the new view? And I kind of give a qualified answer, but I say there's some certain key traits that an organization's got to have in order to do learning teams well. So yes, I'd say start with those 5 principles of HOT and work on those, and start with thinking and then action and then learning teams.
Okay, so Marina says she loves the humility approach to investigating the causes. Would you consider a small organisation involving the workers in a risk assessment with similar outcomes as a learning team?
Yeah, definitely. So I think people who do the work should definitely be involved wherever possible in risk assessments anyway. I think it's kind of a bit crazy, you know, as safety people, we sit down and assess the risk and decide what the risks are and what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, without the involvement of people who do the work. So yeah, and I think actually from memory, Sarah, I think you've actually had a webinar done about that, haven't you, with Mark Alston using a learning team approach for risk assessment. So that's probably not a bad resource to go and look up.
I think we will include that in the email later, just a link to that one. So Valerie says, our team is constantly asked to put together the executive summary of the KPIs, leading lagging indicators, and we would like to find alternatives to this.
Yeah, so I think what would be really useful for any organization is to share some useful stories there, to talk about, here's some, if you were doing, say, for example, learning teams, pick out some highlights. Here's some learning teams that we've done in the last, month, quarter, whatever it is. Here's what we found. Here was some of the surprising things or the interesting things we found. As a consequence, here's some of the things that we've been able to fix, or some of the things we're working on. I think that's way more useful. Even when the stats go up, stats are so, in many respects, they kind of take the humanity out of safety. It's like, oh, we've had so many LTIs. Well, think of that another way. We've had so many workers who have got hurt in work, and here's this one and here's that one. Sharing stories is way more powerful, and it creates a more useful connection, I think, between either the senior leadership of the board and what it is that happens. So I know the stats have got to be there, but we all know what the relative limitations are of just the stats.
Saj says, how long is optimal for each learning team cycle?
First session could be anything from an hour to 2 or 3. Realistically, you want to keep that each session capped really for 2 hours. Beyond that, people are really going to start getting a bit antsy, and there's only so long people can focus and work in that kind of, because it can be quite an intense environment. And as a facilitator as well, beyond 2 hours, you're probably going to be pretty tired. So yeah, if the first session is anything up to 2 hours soak time, then maybe a similar sort of amount of time for your defining, coming up with the key things, and then some solutions. Some organization will go beyond that, though. They'll even do 3 or 4 sessions, but typically you're looking at minimum 2 sessions.
Okay, Stephen says, would you include the people involved in incidents and from historical incidents?
So the person involved in the incident, yes, absolutely, you want them involved. Maybe that's an interesting perspective. Historical incidents as well have been similar. Yep, I certainly wouldn't rule that out either. But yeah, I don't understand how you can do any investigation or learning without the people involved. I heard that said to me on a course recently. Someone had done a flipping university course, no less, and they said, "Oh no, you never want to involve the people who were involved in the incident, because they'll probably tell lies to you." Oh, goodness me, how do we get into a situation when we have people involved in an incident but they're not allowed to be involved in the incident investigation? So yes, definitely.
And James says, what do you think are the right breadcrumbs to drop into a safety strategy that set up learning teams as a successful tactic to address an organisational learning deficit?
Well, it's acknowledged already that the organisation is not very good at learning. I think one thing to get straight into the strategy is we want to be better at learning. So I think having a desire to be, some organizations, we want to be a learning organization, or we want to get better at learning, or whatever the case may be. I think having that overtly set out that we want to get better at learning. Amy Edmondson's done a lot of good stuff on the learning organization and the traits of a learning organization. So I'd tap into some of that for sure. I'm looking back and rereading the question now to make sure. So right breadcrumbs, drop into safety strategy, set up learning teams to be successful. Yeah, so that's the first thing. And then I go back to that article. I wrote about some of the key traits are as well for an organization, but the learning teams well. So it's having the right, perspective on how things go well and how things go wrong. So moving from linear to complexity type thinking, to allowing time for learning to happen. Things like work as imagined versus work as done, getting very comfortable and familiar with that reality. They're just some of the thoughts off the top of my head that would be useful.
All right. Well, I think that's all the questions done.
I think in the chat feed here, there's one from Julie Muxworthy. Who are the best people to facilitate learning teams? It's easy to say who the right people aren't than sometimes say the right people are. Anyone who's going to go in there and kind of rule with an iron fist and assume that they already know the answer and are not going to be very interested in deferring to the learning team, that they're kind of the opposite of what we're looking for. Those people in your organization who are good facilitators, they're good listeners, they're curious, they engage with people, they can keep their cool emotionally, they can hear a lot of different stuff being fired at them and keep their calm, hear it as it's said, and still be curious and not get defensive. there's just some of the traits that are really important. They may be people in your safety department, they may be people in completely different parts of the organization, but they have that skill set. You could say that ultimately they're people. They're people who are good at kind of conversation and being present and kind of authentic with the learning team.
All right. Katie's also shared a link there in the chat to the Hop Lab, the YouTube channel there. So we'll share these links also in the email later today. So that's all the questions, Andy. Thank you so much for joining us again today.
No worries.
That was really good. A lot of good feedback. So thanks, everybody. Hope you have a great rest of your week. Okay.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye.